Hello and welcome to the Solve Network. My name is Shane Borza and I'll be your host. Along with my co-founder Benjamin Goss, we'd like to welcome you. Our mission is to provide solutions and create a network of experts for you to learn from. Now this show is a little different than most podcasts as it is actually a live call held twice a month. If you can, please join us on the first and third Thursday of each month so you can get your questions answered live and direct from the experts themselves. If you're an expert, please contact me at shaneborza.com so you can be a part of the network. And now, here's our show. For those of you at home, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Solve Network. Tonight's guest expert is Val Jennings, who is an executive coach, and she's going to be speaking about EQ and leadership. I'm really excited to have her on because although we know each other and have worked together in various capacities, there is a lot of what she has an expertise in and a lot of what she's going to talk about tonight that I'm sure is going to be new and different. And although I know a little bit about EQ, I'm really interested to see how it fits into leadership.
Scene one, Apple, take one.
Hi, I'm Shane Borza, your content creator coach. I have 2 books on filmmaking, Film Notes, where you learn to write, direct, and produce, and the Film Notes Workbook, where you can learn checklists and paperwork to streamline creating your content. Available at shaneborza.com. I also have filmmaker resources like the Paperwork Bundle with over 300 documents, the Sound Effects Bundle with almost 3,000 files, and the Music Bundle featuring 900 tracks of all genres. Want to build your professional credits? Become an associate producer and get listed on IMDb. Let me help you get your art out into the world.
Scene one, Apple, take one.
Without further ado, please take it away, and we'll be doing a discussion, a Q&A after the presentation.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Shane. Thanks for having me here today. So I am going to share my screen and share my slides so that you can hear what I have to talk about today. Oops, I'm not going to share my Wi-Fi, share my screen. Okay. So what I'm here to talk to you guys today about is leadership, emotional intelligence, and this great model called radical candor. And so we'll dive into that in a moment. But first, I just wanted to introduce myself. So I'm Val, and I'm an executive coach. I have been coaching since about 2014. I have a long background in the corporate world. I've worked at Cisco. I've worked with a lot of high-tech companies. I've worked in HR, but the majority of my career was spent in supply chain management. So lots of business operations and supply chain experience. And I absolutely love what I do now, working as an executive coach, where I get to combine my business experience, my management and leadership experience with the world of coaching. And so I'm so excited to be here and to talk about what I like best and what I get nerdy about. And so why I'm here is, as a management and leadership coach, there's a few things I do. I work with leaders and their teams, and we focus on management and leadership, on their career, and on how to get teams to work together better. As a coach, I really like to look at people as a whole person. So people are their same selves, whether they're at home or at work. And the more we can try to integrate who people are as a leader and at home, that authenticity, the stronger people will be at work and at home. So that's kind of my philosophy about how I work. And today we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence and radical candor. And so if we were a big group today, I would have us do a big exercise together. But since we don't, Shane, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. And I'd love for you, since you know me a little bit, what are a couple things, Shane, that you and I have in common?
I think that we're both genuinely interested in not only in people, but in things. And that, especially for this, I would say, it's like, how do teams work? How does this company operate? Like, what are their values? Like, what's their mission? I think we both really enjoy that. But I think we're also very interested in how to kind of make things work better, like finding solutions and providing kind of tips and tools.
Exactly. I think that's how we're alike too. And so we kind of share this same curiosity about how people can work together better and how people can be themselves and really have their best performance. And one of the reasons why I asked you about how we're the same and what we have in common is that that's an example of how we build empathy with other people. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, one of the pillars of emotional intelligence is actually empathy. And one of the ways that we can work on empathy is looking at people through the eyes of how is this person like me? So this just quick little exercise that Shane and I did together is something that can quickly make us feel like we have something in common. And that's actually a way in which people can build empathy. And so empathy is really, really important. And it's just so ironic. I'll just say today is June 4th. And with everything going on in the world, I cannot emphasize again enough how important empathy is. But empathy is really, really important to leadership. And I wanted to share this quote about empathy from Barack Obama, where he says, learning to stand in somebody else's shoes, to see through their eyes, that's how peace begins. And it's up to you to make that happen. So empathy is a quality of character that can really change the world. And when I work with managers and leaders, they want to make impact and change in their employees and in business. And so one of the things that I work with them on as a coach is how to build empathy. So here's another quote about building empathy, which is empathy is about standing in someone else's shoes, feeling his or her heart, seeing with his or her eyes. Not only is empathy hard to outsource and automate, but it makes the world a better place. And so Shane and those of you listening, I would highly recommend that you look up the work of Daniel Pink. He's one of my favorites. And what I love about this perspective is that when we think about high tech in the world of business, so much is outsourced and automated, but what we can't give to a machine and what we can't code is the sense of being able to empathize with other human beings. And this is really what makes people great leaders and what makes the world a better place. So one more quote really quick on this. Richard Branson, he's the CEO of Virgin Atlantic and among other things. He says great things can be achieved by leading through wisdom, empathy, and integrity with no other agenda other than humanity. So just being human. So when leaders work with me, one of the things I want to help them develop is a really good sense of empathy so that they can show their humanity to others. So many leaders get elevated to the point that they're at because they're really good at what they do. They're really good at their technology. They're really good at their craft in business. They have a lot of degrees. But comes a certain point in leadership where so much of the work that leaders do is about influencing and connecting with other people that this quality of empathy becomes super, super important. And so when we think about emotional intelligence, there's a really great book that I want to introduce you guys to, which I'll talk about in just one second. But there's an intersection of power or an intersection of greatness, an intersection of wisdom that comes from EQ. So you could say that emotional intelligence is EI, but the way we measure EQ the way we measure emotional intelligence is EQ. Same with IQ, which is the way we measure intelligence. So this combination of emotional intelligence and the intelligence of intellect is really what makes a leader great. So there's a book that I love. So if you are looking for a new book for your professional development or even your personal development, this is a book that I actually almost always have it on my desk to refer to all the time. I use it a lot with clients and worksheets. But just a little bit to teach you about what EQ is. So there's actually an assessment that you can take. And if it's something that interests you, feel free to reach out and I can help you take the assessment. But it's measured on a 30-point scale, 130-point scale, much like an IQ test. And it measures 15 different competencies. And we're going to talk about 2 of them today. And it also measures the relationship between the competencies. So it's not enough to just be good at one thing at the expense of another. We want our emotions to be balanced. So a good emotional intelligence assessment is going to measure the relationships between competencies. And the good thing about emotional intelligence is that it actually can be learned. So there's research that shows that we can actually develop our emotional intelligence and continue becoming more emotionally intelligent up until our 60s and 70s, whereas IQ is really maxed out at about age 25, 27 when our brain development stops. So EQ is one of these things that's based on experience. You can actually learn to get better at it, which is really important for leaders because in order to maximize their influence and their impact, they need to have really good EQ. So I was talking a little earlier about how emotional intelligence is about balance. So what we're going to dive into today is two of, I think, the most critical competencies of emotional intelligence, which are empathy, that we've talked about quite a bit, and assertiveness. So when you take an emotional intelligence assessment, this is one of the things that they look for is how well are you able to balance those two things. So let's dive into what that means. So assertiveness is really the ability to express your feelings in a non-offensive way. So the signs of assertiveness are that you show respect for another person's point of view, that you're able to stand up for your point of view, even if there's a disagreement, and you have the ability to say no respectfully. And one of the foundational skills to be able to be assertive is to have empathy. So in order to express your feelings in a non-judgmental way, you have to have empathy for those around you. Aggression, on the other hand, is also something that's important to be able to show, but it's something to be very careful in using. So it means making your point and bringing forth your opinion without consideration of another person's thoughts or feelings. It leaves no room for compromise, shows no respect for other people's feelings or for their point of view, and it really forces the other person to take your side. And it's even sometimes where people who are super aggressive show public criticism. So it might surprise you to hear me say that this is actually important. But aggression can be important if you are in a dangerous situation. So if you're walking down the street and getting attacked in New York City, being able to act aggressively is actually really, really important. However, when leaders get this balance wrong and err too much on the side of aggression, there's no other way of looking at it than they're just an asshole. I mean, so this is not what we want from a leader. So this balance becomes really, really important. And so in the workplace, this balance of empathy, assertiveness, aggression is so beautifully demonstrated in another book that I'm going to recommend to you, which is this book called Radical Candor. So there's a woman named Kim Scott who used to be an executive at Google. And she wrote this book called Radical Candor, which really talks about how to be a strong, kick-ass boss without losing that sense of humanity. So she didn't specifically write the book to talk about assertiveness, aggression, and empathy, but she illustrates it so well that this is a book that I really recommend for my clients. So let's dive into what Kim's theory is, and you'll see how it starts to relate to empathy and aggression. Okay, so Kim Scott has a theory that the best form of communication is what she calls radical candor. And so she has a 2x2, or a 2x2, a 4x4, I guess it's called a 4x4, where she has a couple axes. So the top one is caring personally. So in emotional intelligence language, we would call this having empathy. And then she has another direction that she calls challenging directly, which you could say is being assertive. And so when you fall into anything but radical candor, you have the risk of really impacting relationships in a negative way. And so what I love about using this model with leaders is that they themselves can learn how to play in that radical candor quadrant. And they can also see in their teams when people are falling into these other quadrants so that if you have very little ability to challenge directly, but care too much personally, she calls that ruinous empathy. Manipulous insincerity is when you don't care personally and you don't challenge directly. Another word for that might be passive aggressive behavior. And then obnoxious aggression is when you challenge directly without caring about people. So what I really like to do with leaders and teams is take them deep into each one of these. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this today because just in respect for time, but just very quickly, ruinous empathy is where someone overuses the emotional intelligence of empathy. So they're just completely so worried about what other people think that they can't find themselves, they can't be assertive. So assertiveness, remember, has empathy and the ability to speak up for yourself. So when someone is in an organization or in leadership is too empathetic and avoids bringing up what they really think, we call that ruinous empathy. Manipulative insincerity is when you really don't care enough about others to really challenge what they think. So actually, Shane, I'm going to pick on you again for a second. One of the things you and I have done working together is given each other feedback on our work. So if I don't care about you, I might just say, oh, Shane looks great. But by me finding a way to, and that would be manipulatively insincere. So if I were using radical candor, I would care enough about you to tell you the truth. So manipulative insincerity is when people really don't care, and so therefore they don't say what they think. So that's manipulative insincerity. Obnoxious aggression, and I'm stumbling on my words tonight, is flat out aggression. It's just, I don't care what others have to say. I'm going to say what I have to say. I think I have the right to say what I'm going to say because I'm in charge. We could get into a conversation about politics here, I guess, but sometimes this happens where people think I have the right to say what I think. I have the right to tell you what I think and the right to be direct just because I'm a leader. But the problem is that when you do that publicly and you do that without showing empathy and care, you come across as an obnoxious leader. You really are aggressive and obnoxious. And so the good news is that leaders can really learn to be in that place that's radically candid. So they can step into their assertiveness, step into their empathy and working with a coach really helps. And what it does is when they can be in that space of radical candor, what it does is it builds trust with the team because people know that you care about them and that you're going to actually say what you think. It helps teams embrace conflict because it creates a space where it's okay to challenge one another directly as long as they do it with kindness, because it shows that you actually care about the work, you care about the people. So it's not an invitation to nitpick. It's not an invitation to overshare your deeply personal stuff. It's an invitation to be very professional in your workplace and also show that you care. So where to start if you want to kind of boost your radical candor is invite feedback from others. Invite people to challenge you. Jump in and start practicing this muscle. So show people that you care and show them that you can challenge them, that you can give them feedback. And it's just a great way to practice assertiveness and caring. So what we're really, in takeaway, in closing, just what we're really focusing on here is that EQ is absolutely critical to leadership. And you can increase your EQ through self-awareness and just practicing some of these concepts. So really thinking about your empathy, your assertiveness, and your aggressiveness. And this radical candor model really demonstrates how to balance these things really well. So if you're interested in learning more about radical candor, Kim Scott has some great videos on YouTube. You can just Google up her name and find some quick, easy videos that talk about where she talks about her model. And there's also really great videos on YouTube about empathy and assertiveness and aggression. So this is something that if you're interested in learning, it's actually not too hard to learn more of. But super, super important in leadership. So one thing that I always say is that it is kind to be clear. So that's what I'll leave you with today, is that if you're not clear, it's actually not kind. People you work with need to hear what you really think in a kind way. So Shane, that's what I have for you today.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know that you had said initially this is from a longer presentation that you do, but I think that really just that foursquare of kind of showing the different places. I mean, just for myself, I was able to very quickly kind of scroll through like all these past working relationships and be like, oh, that was this job and that was this job. And I could kind of see where people are. So the first kind of, I guess, thing that I would like you to discuss a little more is, what would you say to people who come from a really strong culture, such as, because you mentioned politics or like the military or something like that, where it's or even like academia, it's kind of like steeped in tradition. There's a certain way that the culture is, that maybe there's a pecking order or there's some kind of very rigid structure or hierarchy. So if you're in that and it seems like there's no ability to change the dynamic, what would you recommend to people if they're feeling like, everyone I'm dealing with is in one of these quadrants that I don't feel comfortable in. I want to try and shift to this other quadrant. How would they go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and actually there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing that came to mind, which might not be the answer to your question, but is important. So if I forget the question, definitely remind me. But I've actually coached quite a few leaders in business who are ex-military, who have that military background. And so I wanted to comment on that because I thought you might be interested in this as well, Shane, is a lot of what is taught with leaders in the military is to take emotion out of things. So when people's lives are in danger, you have to quickly make decisions. You can't always stop and think about how it's going to make everybody feel. You have to make decisions quickly. So in the military, there is room for that really strong assertiveness, even aggression sometimes, because people's lives are in danger and you have to make quick decisions. Where I've seen that people struggle is when they make the transition from military to business or even from military to family, where a lot of people need you to acknowledge them as a person and to acknowledge their thoughts and feelings in order for you to be heard. So there's a different dynamic in the military versus what a lot of business people have. Now, a lot of military leaders become great business people when they figure this out, is that they have to really elevate their self-awareness so that they can rebuild their empathy, because it's a different skill set. So your second question was about, what do you do when you're in an environment where people aren't honoring this? That is a great question. So it's interesting. When I first developed and taught this workshop, it was actually a request from a client because they wanted their staff to build more radical candor. And so sometimes, even when the people you are dealing with fall into the other three quadrants, they're ruinously empathetic or they're obnoxiously aggressive. When you start behaving this way, using empathy and kindness and being really clear, people notice and people want more. So a lot of times what happens is that people get into one of the other three quadrants because of their insecurities and because of their habits. But for a leader to step in that place that has radically candid conversation, it's interesting how people become drawn to that and they want more of it. So the first thing I would say is to try practicing it yourself and see how those around you how those around you do it. The other thing is sometimes it might be that you're in the wrong environment. Sometimes it might be that, this is the place that I need to get out of. And that's such great self-awareness to realize that you might be in a work environment that's really not healthy and that's not going to get you to where you want to be.
Especially when someone is that kind of leader that people look to, there's so much responsibility almost in kind of daring to make the change. Yeah. So I think that there's a different kind of challenge there. Whereas if you're the employee, you kind of go, well, how am I going to change the office? But I think that same question could come from a different perspective for the person who runs the office and say, okay, I'm in charge. How am I going to change the office? So would you just say the same thing, or would there be a different kind of recommendation because the dynamic is different for someone who's in the leadership role?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I love about this model is that it takes these concepts of emotional intelligence and makes it really practical in the 4 quadrants. So I think for leaders, being able to practice the radical candor themselves is really important, but also being able to recognize it in their team dynamics. So just as you were saying that you could easily recognize in the 4 quadrants where different people you've worked with have been, or I would challenge too, we've all played in all those quadrants before, depending on circumstances. And so it's a good way for leaders to give feedback to their organization and say, hey, if somebody is in that ruinously empathetic quadrant, that might be a way for a leader to say, hey, I would love to see you share your ideas more. You do a great job of being kind and empathetic to others, but I would really love to hear what you have to think. So I think it gives leaders the language to start working with their employees. And likewise, if someone, and we've all worked with this person or maybe been this person before, who just says what they think without caring, I think this model gives the leaders the language to be able to say, look, being assertive and being able to speak your mind is really important to our business. So thank you. What I would also like you to do is just show people that you care, show people that you can show kindness and that you appreciate their point of view as well. So I think it's a long answer, Shane, but I think that one of the great things about some of these models, these leadership models, is that they give teams language to use. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question. So is there any way you want to rephrase it for me, or did I cover it?
No, I think that's really helpful. And, coming from, I worked at a corporate company job for almost 10 years. And when I was leaving, I was running teams. And one of the things that was interesting for me looking back on it is I started like part-time and then went to full-time, and then went to a supervisor, and then went to assistant manager, and then went to manager. And so I was able to see pretty much with the same people all of these different dynamics because my role changed with the same people. And so my interacting with that team had to change. And so that's why I wanted to ask kind of both sides of that.
Yeah. And so I'll mention something else too, is that what your experience that you're describing, your personal experience about the way you moved up in an organization is really, really common, where you started in a certain level, you move up. And a lot of times no one stops to work with you on how to notice the dynamic, how to notice it in yourself. And so that's where working with a coach can be really, really powerful, is that a coach can help people understand, and this is what I do with my clients, is it helps people understand some of the language and the dynamic that goes on around communication with their team. So just a quick story. Today, I actually had a client who, given the political environment of the week, she said, how do I find a voice with my team? How do I know what to say to them? So we really talked through that in the context of being empathetic and being assertive. So we talked about, how can you show people that you really care about what they're feeling right now? How can you show people that you want to understand their point of view, especially if there's racially charged things at work? How can you really listen and be empathetic? And how can you then also be assertive about how you want people to be together in the workplace? So it's this combination of being kind and hearing people and recognizing that people have their stories, which is the empathetic part, but also recognizing that when you do that, people are much more likely to hear you when you're being direct. So I think, anyway, back to your example of you moving up in an organization, is that sometimes when you move quickly, you are promoted for your expertise, but not necessarily for your leadership. And so these are the kinds of things that it almost seems, as I was sharing with you, it might also seem like, well, duh, this is how you should be. So some of these things are, once you stop and think about them, they become clear. but we don't always get this chance to stop and think about it unless you have a session with a coach and then you talk about it more.
How do you try to integrate those two halves, not only even in like one person, but like in a company or in a team? Because quite often if you have, especially a small team of like 10 people, you're probably going to have a couple that gravitate to one and a couple that gravitate to the other.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's interesting. So I'm going to make some huge, broad generalizations that aren't fair right now, but I've noticed that in high tech, there are certain job functions that tend to really emphasize the IQ part. So when you look at a finance organization, an engineering organization, they tend to be very focused on numbers and figures and things that they have learned, things that they know to add intelligence to an organization. And so one of the things that's really important in leadership in those organizations is to not forget that the people are very important too, and that they have to remember. So an engineering leader not only needs to be really good at coding and designing, but also needs to be able to manage the people. And likewise, I work with people in HR. So in HR functions like recruiting or, doing talent assessment, or HR functions where is HR business partners, where they're naturally inclined to want to work with people and more that emotional side. And so they have to remember that they do need to use data in order to influence. They need to use that IQ side in order to be more balanced. So I think what I would tell people is that both are super, super important. But it's interesting. I think there's a lot of studies that show that EQ is actually what gets you farther, is, that being emotionally intelligent and having the awareness emotionally. So both super important.
If people have this self-identity of I'm an intellectual person or I'm not, or I'm an emotional person or I'm not, I think they kind of build that personality for themselves, and it's almost like they can't see out of it. So if someone in a team, or we talk about both employees and leaders, but let's just say anyone notices that someone is very much like in a certain role, other than kind of leading with empathy and doing some of the things you asked before, like is there anything that you could suggest of like, okay, how do I get this person out of the box they're in and show them that they're more than just that one thing?
Yeah, a couple ways. I love that question. So one of the reasons that one of the things I love about executive coaching is that I remind people that they're a whole person. And so when people say, well, my intellect is the most important thing, I make decisions based on my intellect only, I'm a problem solver, none of this black and white stuff, but there's always black and white answers to everything. One of the things I always ask them is, well, how does that work? How is that working for you at home? How does that work for you with your kids? How does that work for you with your wife or husband? How are people you in close relationship reacting to that? And what I almost always find is people will say, oh my gosh, my husband tells me that too. Or, oh my gosh, my wife says this, is that I'm always a problem solver. I'm always looking at things from a numbers and figures perspective and trying to solve. And so I think when we look at them as a whole person, they might think that the intellect is what's most important at work. But in order to have good relationships outside of work, you have to be empathetic to the people who you're in relationship with. And so often when we make that connection about, who are you at home? Who are you with your friends? The light bulb will go off. So that's one way. The other way is something I know you're very familiar with, which is to think about somatic wisdom. So the wisdom of the body. Sometimes people who aren't in touch with their emotions can benefit from learning to pay attention to their body. So, for example, if you are an engineering leader, a finance leader, someone who's very into solving problems and your intellect, I encourage people to start to pay attention to what their body is doing. So, for example, if you go to give a presentation, do your palms get sweaty? Do you feel nervous and feel your fists start to clench? Do you have your heart flutter? These are your body's way of telling you you are feeling something. you are feeling something. Now let's try to put some words to what it is that you're feeling. Is it fear? Is it nervousness? Is it you're intimidated? Is it excitement? So again, kind of this is where coaching is so fun, is looking at the person as a whole person. They have a mind, they have intellect, they have emotion, and they have physical sensations. With my clients, I tend to call it body signals. I know that in coaching, a lot of times we call it, embodiment, or we call it somatics, but I just think of, body signals. We all have it happen. When do you get nervous? When do you get afraid? And what happens to your body? So that's a second way. So the first way was check in with your family. What do they say about you? Check in with your body. And then the third way that I think is really powerful is using, I mentioned this earlier when I first started talking, is using emotional intelligence assessments. So sometimes for people who are really skewed to the intellectual numbers and facts and figures side, having something on a 130-point scale, which they can measure and look at the numbers and look at the graphs involved with it, helps them see for themselves how they're feeling when they might not even know that about themselves. So super long-winded answer to your simple question, but you can tell I get really nerdy about this stuff. This is what I love about my job.
Well, good. No, I think that's really helpful, and especially having options in the answer, because, as I mentioned earlier, if you have people listen to this and we're only talking about A, B, and C, and then the people who are X, Y, Z are going to not have it feel like it relates to them. So having those different answers, like, oh, the body, like I get it, or other people like the body that I don't get it, so
right.
So that's really helpful. And I always encourage people, it's not a run-on answer. It's a kind of optional answer for different groups of people.
Yeah, there's different ways to do it. And I think what was fun for me about answering your question is that's what I love about coaching, is as I get to know someone, I can start to see which of these avenues really resonates with them. So do I want to probe and ask more questions about the emotion? Do I want to ask more questions about the body? Do I want to rely on an assessment that gives them more empirical data? So any of these things are really good doors to open into them being a person, and I think so much of what we do in the corporate world, and actually Kim Scott talks about this in her book, the Radical Candor book, so much what we're taught in the professional world is that in order to be professional, you can't be a real human being. And what I love about coaching is, my belief is, no, in order to be successful in business and to be professional, you have to be a human being. And so, otherwise people really don't want to work with you. So it's just a fun area for me to work in.
If someone's in that situation, it's kind of like, well, this is how it is. How do you help them turn that on and off? So for instance, I'm going to go home and I'm going to have the good relationship with my family, knowing that I'm going to go back to work and go back into the protocol kind of intellect only, but then also turn it back off again when I go home. And so not finding yourself intellecting only at home or emoting at work when neither one of those things work. So kind of either tools or tips for people to kind of like tune the radio dial back and forth from different stations.
Yeah, that's such a great question. So if you think back to one of the first slides I showed, there was a little guy with a balance beam on a tightrope. So the reality is that this balance is something we all have to do all the time. Sometimes you need to lean a little bit one way or the other, depending on the situation that you're in as a leader. And so I would say the way to turn that on and off is super, super intense self-awareness. What am I doing? Who am I with? And what are the consequences of the way I'm going to act? So for example, if you need to act quickly, make a big decision without considering other people's feelings, there might be consequences to that as a leader. And so paying attention to that and taking responsibility for that action, knowing that you might need to have a discussion with somebody later. Hey, how did you make that feel? How did that make you feel? Kind of reconnecting with them as a person is part of the responsibility of a leader. And so I think one of the tricks that I have, or one of the strategies that I have leaders really think about is not only what are they doing in those situations where they have to turn it on and off, but who are they? Who are they? Which mask are they wearing? Right? We all have different pieces of us that we need to show up as. And, which piece of me am I going to use? Which skill, which part of my toolbox, which mask, which hat am I going to put on in this situation? And it requires a lot of self-awareness and a lot of understanding the impact. I always say that we are 100% responsible for the impact we have on other people. And just understanding that impact. And, the other thing it also leads to is being open to feedback, being able to listen to other people so that when they tell you, hey, I appreciate that you were that way, or hey, that hurt me that you were that way. This is all part of the responsibility of being able to manage your emotional intelligence well. There are situations where you have to go one way or the other. For example, if someone in your family or in your workplace is really, really hurting, that's time to really crank up the empathy, really listen, show them that you care. That's not the time to tell them what to do. So there's a balance, always a balance.
So I really want to thank you for your time and your teaching tonight. Is there anything that you'd like to wrap up with as far as EQ, IQ, leadership, anything?
Yeah, so I'll just add that, today we just talked about two of multiple elements of emotional intelligence. There's, 15 different competencies, and they all balance each other out in different ways. So I love diving into emotional intelligence with clients, because I think that one of the most powerful things about understanding our own emotions and engaging with others is putting the language around what we're doing, how we're feeling. That really helps build self-awareness. So I guess the one thing I would add is this is just the tip of the iceberg of where you can go with the concept of emotional intelligence. And it's all so important to leadership, whether you're leading in a company or in your community or in your family, your church, whatever. It's just all super important.
One of the things we always like to do at the end of the call is kind of invite whoever the speaker is to kind of talk a little more about the practice, what they have going on, or, put a spotlight on anything that they would like to do. And you had mentioned earlier that if anyone's interested in kind of taking some of these assessments, you help them. But you also just talked about how this is the tip of the iceberg. So if anyone's listening to this, or you just want to kind of broadcast like a little more about like what you offer, or if you have programs, or I know you have a couple book recommendations, I'd like to learn more about not only how people can contact you and where, but how they could work with you, and not only maybe individually or as a team, and how you could kind of provide some of these resources to them.
Yeah. So the best way to find me is on LinkedIn, Val Jennings. And then I also have my company name is called How Do You Manage? And so you can find me, I find my website that way too, or my email is just val@howdoyoumanage. And so really people work with me most on management and leadership coaching. So a lot of times, people in the workplace hire me to come help them be better leaders, better managers, and to work with their teams. And I think one of my favorite things to do is pull together customized workshops for leaders and their teams based on what I see and hear is going on with their team. And I do that through, like an emotional intelligence certification is something I have on my toolbox myself. So what I love to do is kind of listen to a client, figure out what they need, and then just reach into my bag of tools and pull things together in service of them. And so I am open to chat with people about these concepts. I love just having informational chats. People can, find me or reach out to me and ask for some of my time. Because as you can tell, I get really excited about these topics.
And as a last thing, you recommended looking up Kim Scott on YouTube.
Yeah.
You recommended the EQ Edge book and the Radical Candor. Is there anything else that you would point out to people, either book, movie, training resource? You said you have an EQ certification.
Yeah, so there's a certification that I have through, it's called Multi-Health Systems. It's called MHS, and they certify people in all different kinds of competencies. And I really, really like their emotional intelligence certification they have, and I've been through that. So you learn how to do the assessment, you learn all the different competencies, and I use that in my work so much. Whether it's, it's funny, I don't even use the assessment that much, but just the concepts of emotional intelligence, I think, are fascinating. And really, I find that when you can give people language of what they're feeling and what they're doing, it sort of takes some of the angst or some of the fear out of it. And so that's a great resource, is to look up the MHS certification for emotional intelligence as well. And it's based on that same book that I shared. It's all the same work. So that's another thing that I would recommend people do. Yeah, so the book by Kim Scott, her YouTube videos. I also mentioned Daniel Pink. Daniel Pink has some great videos on YouTube. If you just Google up, or if you just search him on YouTube, there's some really great videos he's done on leadership and management in the workplace that are very easy to understand, very clear, good stuff.
Perfect. Well, that's great. And I had never heard of MHS, so that's a new resource for me as well.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you being on. I hope everyone got a lot out of this talk. Hi, I'm Shane Borza, a climber, creator, and coach, and I want you to build the skill of health and fitness. My new course is a priceless gift to you, and it's available exclusively on ponoquest.com. That's PONO Quest.com. Build the Skill is a minimalistic, functional, real-world fitness program which can help you to move better and get stronger faster. I can't wait for you to check it out, and when you do, please let me know how it helps you. That's Build the Skill at ponoquest.com. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Solve Network. As a reminder, these calls are held live on the first and third Thursday of each month. If you'd like to join us as either a listener or guest expert, please contact me at shaneborza.com. On behalf of my co-founder, Benjamin Goss, we're glad you are a part of the network and hope you are finding solutions. If you need solutions, please reach out.